On campuses around the world, particularly in California, at Columbia, at Harvard University, in Britain, at Oxford, where there's endemic anti-Semitism, we've seen a new strain of what we now call a new anti-Semitism. And the new anti-Semitism in some ways is more pernicious because it cleverly disguises itself as merely being criticism of Israel. Oh, no, no, no. I have nothing against Jews. I just can't stand those Nazi-like Zionist, oppressive, militaristic racists of the apartheid regime of Israel. Well, the U.S. State Department has a working definition of what anti-Semitism is. And in fact, if you hold Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the Israeli government, if you deny the Holocaust or accuse Israelis of perpetrating a new Holocaust against the hapless Palestinians, if you libel and slander and demonize Israel out of proportion with all other nations on earth in a relentless fashion, which is very customary by the enemies of Israel, this in fact is anti-Semitism, regardless of whether the perpetrators want to accept that label or not. And many don't. Many don't. They say, no, I have the right to free speech, and I'm just talking about the politics of Israel. But when a black Muslim chaplain comes on the UC Irvine campus and points to Jewish kids in the audience and says, y'all are the new Nazis, Jewish kids on an American campus are Nazis because they support Israel or the idea of Israel? The idea that Israelis are Nazis in itself is the world turned upside down. There's no genocide going on there. There were 600,000 original Palestinian refugees who left Israel at the founding of the Jewish state. There's now 4 or 5 million of them. Where's the genocide? There's not only millions more, but they're living in much better conditions as a result of Israel being there. So what's going on campuses? In April, there was a conference at the Kennedy School at Harvard University, a one-state solution conference to investigate the feasibility of a one-state solution. What is a one-state solution? It means bringing 5 million angry, hostile, and potentially murderous Palestinians into Israel, into making it a binational state, and demographically killing the Jewish state because of the population shift. Is that social justice? It's social justice for the Palestinians, perhaps. But the Jewish state would no longer be in existence. So at this supposed academic conference at the Kennedy School, Harvard University, a pretty good school, 19 speakers, every single one was an anti-Israel, anti-Western, anti-American, pro-Palestinian activist. What kind of an academic conference is that? And this goes on in Middle Eastern study centers, where the entire faculty of Middle Eastern study centers, funded by Saudi petrodollars, hundreds of millions of dollars filtered into the universities to set up Middle Eastern study centers, where every faculty member has the same ideology, that imperialism, Western intervention, militarism, and the values of the West are the problems for the pathologies of the Middle East, that the Middle East is suffering as a result of it. And all of these faculty and all of these Middle Eastern centers, almost without exception, share the idea that Israel and America are to blame for interfering. And there's an obsession, as Ruth Wise at Harvard University said, that scholars are obsessed with the obsession of Israel. How much attention can there be? 60,000 people killed in Syria this year, and people are calling for divestment from Israel because they built an apartheid wall? The other world turned upside down is this idea of Israel being a racist apartheid regime, which is how they mobilize well-meaning but ignorant students on campus to get behind the Palestinian cause, as if this is analogous to what happened in South Africa, where you had black people being oppressed and denied rights by a white minority. There's no apartheid in Israel. It's a democratic society. There's Christian and Arab citizens of Israel who enjoy more civil and human rights than they would in any surrounding Arab country or any Muslim land. There's no apartheid. But every year in March, on 40 campuses around the world, we have Israel Apartheid Week, a week-long opportunity for activists who despise Israel and want to destroy its credibility in the world's view, spend a week calling it a racist apartheid regime that's oppressing a poor, hapless population of supposedly indigenous Palestinians who, through no fault of their own, are stateless, even though they've been offered a state in 1937, in 1947, in 1967, in 2000, in 2005, and in every opportunity to have it, they've walked away from the table. Why? Because the issue of having a state is not what motivates and animates the discussion. The issue is not having an Israel. The issue is not having two states living side by side in peace, or whether the borders are going to be the 67 borders or the 48 borders. The borders are not important. Israel is 8,000 square miles, the size of New Jersey. The Arab world is 1.5 million square miles. This is not about land. This is about a Jewish autonomous presence with a democratic society in the midst of what is considered to be Muslim territory. And so what's going on campuses, disguised as an attempt to bring social justice to Palestinians, has turned into a campaign to demonize the only democratic autonomous state in the Middle East.
We have to realize at the very same time that when we talk about Israel, it is also the age of reason. We think about the fact that Israel and the Israelis in the last few years have won 11 Nobel Prizes. We think that in 1948, Israel exported $43 million worth of goods, and last year exported $47 billion worth of goods. That Israel had virtually no high-tech industry as recently as 30 years ago. Today it has over 100 foreign research and development centers in Israel, and Israel exported $17 billion worth of goods. And even beyond that, the New York Times now says Israel, little Israel with less than 8 million people, is one of the 4 great high-tech powers in the world. And when we look, for example, at anti-missile defense systems, whether we're talking about Iron Dome, we're talking about David Sling, Magic Wand, or we're talking about Arrow 3, multi-billion-dollar cooperation with the United States in which Israelis and Americans are working together as if little Israel could be considered on the same level in high technology as the United States. But something else is also important beyond this tremendous economic transformation of a poor Schlepsedica country in the 1950s, of Dov Yosef's austerity, of a couple $1,000 GNP per capita, to today a country with $33,000 GNP per capita, actually exceeding Great Britain. We need to think about something else that people talk about less, and that is the extent to which Israel has truly gone global. Not simply in its economy, not simply in its high technology, even now becoming a fashion center, but rather in yet one other area. And that is that when Israel was created by the UN Resolution 181 in November of 1947 and declared independence in May of 1948, Israel was recognized by barely 30 countries. As late as 1988, right before the end of the Cold War, Israel was recognized by only 80 countries around the world. Today, Israel is recognized by 162 countries in the world and in all of the major powers. In the late 1980s, I first went abroad for the State Department giving talks in Beijing, in Moscow, and in New Delhi. At that time, they had one major thing in common. There was no recognition of Israel in any of those 3 major countries. Today, the situation is radically different. Yuval Steinitz, the Israeli finance minister, last January went to New Delhi to sign a framework and amazing agreement with the Indians that will provide for a free trade zone of $15 billion a year between India and Israel. India and Israel also work together, whether it is building missiles together, whether it's high technology, whether it's combating terrorism. When we think also of Israel's new relationship with China, $3 to $4 billion worth of trade, Israel now with a major embassy in Beijing, $17 million, Israel with consulates in Shanghai and Guangzhou. But perhaps the most amazing thing is that Israel has managed to build a powerful relationship with the country that is the reason why the majority of the American Jewish community, including my grandparents from Lithuania, came to the United States. And that, of course, is Russia, well known for its anti-Semitism, and even today, with the pogroms long in the past, also the tens of billions of dollars worth of aid and arms for the Arab states and Palestinian terrorist groups, even with all of that gone, what is amazing is that under Vladimir Putin, a warm and fuzzy and really very energetic and lovable kind of guy, they have built a new, strong relationship. We see it today in Silicon Valley, right here. We're right near here, of course, with Palo Alto and Silicon Valley and San Jose. But what's powerful is the Russians now, with their second bite at the apple, after the first one failed, the Russians are now building their second effort in Skolkovo, in the suburbs of Moscow, at Silicon Valley. Got $135 million from the big firms that are right here in Northern California, but they turn to the Israelis to help manage their own Silicon Valley. And they just opened a $50 million Jewish museum in Moscow. Who could believe that? Emphasizing Jewish contributions to Russia. And yet they have driven out millions of Jews to become American Jews rather than Russian Jews. And equally important, when Vladimir Putin was standing right next to Avigdor Lieberman, the most beloved foreign minister that Israel has ever had, just a little joke, Vladimir Putin said we have a unique and special relationship with the Israelis that we have with no other country. So in conclusion, what do we see? We see that it is the worst of times, and the threats from Iran, the possibilities of Pakistan, the Syrian chemical weapons, the problems with Muslim Brotherhood, the spread of AQIM throughout Northern Africa. But in some other ways, it is the best of times, because Israel has finally become a power, a global power, not just in military, not just in intelligence, but in the trademark, the most important element of the 21st century, high technology, nanotechnology, and biotech.
We're basically close to 20 years post the Oslo Peace Accords. Obviously Oslo did not come to fruition in the sense of what the intention of Oslo was by way of a two-state solution. And the question really is for Israelis, is really where are they going forward as a result of this current environment. In Israel, in Hebrew, it's called the matzav. That is the environment they live in, and the question really relates to who do we have to deal with, and what the peace process might look like. All of this by way of saying that we have to also question the modality of what has become known as the two-state solution. Under that assumption, there is a belief that there is a contiguous Palestinian state between Gaza and Ramallah. And really, it even goes deeper geographically. It also assumes that Palestinian society itself is united. The fact that Palestinians are a cohesive, united society. That indeed could not be further from the truth. What you have is West Bankers who are ideologically, socially Jordanians, and you have Gazans who are ideologically, socially Egyptian. There's hardly any intermarriage between the two societies. One is perceived as a much lower class society. There are derogatory terms between the two, even to a point linguistically where West Bankers perceive the Arabic spoken by Gazans as less polished than the one spoken by West Bankers. Even further, if a West Banker is looking for any kind of financial aid, he or she is not going to his relative living in Gaza, he's going to Jordan, and vice versa in Egypt. That in itself is quite telling about the idea of Palestinian unity. For all his many flaws, Yasser Arafat was able to walk and talk the Palestinian cause like nobody else, in every way that he presented the Palestinian agenda, the way he dressed, the way he tied his keffiyeh, the Arab head cover, and the way he spoke about it. What was unique about Arafat, that at least he represented both segments of Palestinian society. These cleavages have become much more visible post-2004, now that Arafat is out of the scene. Another layer that needs to be addressed, is, of course, is that when you have the rise of Hamas as a majority body of the Palestinian Authority, is that you also have a tension between secularism and religiosity. Secularism, that the one expressed by the Fatah movement and the Fatah political party in the West Bank predominantly, versus Hamas religious ideologically working out of Gaza. That also has caused over the past few months clashes internally between Palestinians amongst Palestinians as a result of an attempt by Hamas to basically expand the terrain to the West Bank. These factors are really what are questioning exactly what we have to deal with as we move forward. The challenges for Israel and the United States, we have a similar foreign policy. That is, we do not negotiate with terrorist organizations. So if you look at the State Department list of terrorist organizations, Hamas is still a terrorist organization, considered to be a foreign terrorist organization, an FTO. Same foreign policy Israelis have as well. The challenge for Israelis is that what happens when you have kidnapped soldiers that are used as bargaining chips, and they are forced to negotiate with them, as we've seen with Gilad Shalit and the Second Lebanon War with Goldwasser and Regev, and other instances as far as Israeli MIAs. It is also highlighted who are the two parties we're dealing with. In practical, pragmatic terms, and in realistic terms, no American official goes to Gaza today, because Gaza is considered to be a terrorist entity. So no American official goes to Gaza. They only go to the West Bank. They deal with Salam Fayyad, the current prime minister, and Abu Mazen. And the same with Israel. If they can avoid dealing with Hamas, as we've seen over the last few months, we've seen violent clashes. We only deal with Hamas in that regard, but there's not really a political way. The challenge is that, what happens when when Abbas and Fayyad say something, Hamas comes back and says, whatever you guys promised the Americans or the Israelis, it's declared as null and void because we are the majority party of the Palestinian Authority. And that's this tension. If you look at what this has done to the two-state solution at large, the State Department still believes in a contiguous Palestinian state between Gaza and the West Bank. That, again, is a myth. In the 90s, we tried to create something called the Safe Passage, the idea you could create a highway between Gaza and Ramallah, and you would be able to create this facts on the ground as far as making this happen. Actually, at the end of the day, it was shelved by the Palestinian Authority because of these cleavages at the time, not to mention the fear of security issues of throwing rockets off the bridge and what would happen to Israeli towns and cities. But the whole concept itself was predominantly shelved because they did not see that unification happening. What it means in practical terms, as we look at where we're going forward, if we're going to see any kind of peaceful negotiations, and if we're talking about where the current Israeli government is going forward now under Netanyahu, with coalition with Yesh Atid and others, is predominantly we're going to see a movement towards an attempt to create some kind of peace movement between Israel and the West Bank. That's where the economy is doing much better. That's where you have much more secularism. That's where you're seeing some kind of movement and acknowledgement. Even the Palestinian police are trained by the Israelis and our American forces. So you see that collaboration happening as far as trying to create law and order and a valuable economy. Gaza has to be off the table. Unfortunately, what I'm telling you, though we talk about, these realities on the ground, this is not the modality that is seen outside of Israel, and we talk about still a two-state solution, and that has to be examined if we're looking forward to create some kind of peace between Israelis and Palestinians.
My question is about what's happening on college campuses. So what needs to happen, can we do, to turn the world downside up?
It's a huge problem. One of the problems on campuses is because many of us are alarmed at the speakers that come to campus, like Norman Finkelstein and this Malik Ali that I mentioned, who called the kids Nazis and accuses Zionists of controlling the media and running the world, all the old anti-Semitic tropes. The problem on campuses is and steered out of courses because they're being taught by professors that have an anti-Israel bias or an anti-Jewish bias, or they're being blamed for being pro-Zionist or pro-Israel, or they're perceived as being that way, and it's making them feel uncomfortable, and no kid should have to go through that. The problem on campuses, from the perspective of the administration, is that one of the cardinal virtues of the universities is this concept of academic free speech. And for faculty, it's almost absolute, that they can say anything that they want. It can be radical, it can be stupid, it can be totally wrong-headed, but they have the right to say it. That doesn't mean that an administration has to go along with it. So if somebody, and the irony is, and the sad part of this commentary is, that administrators know very well that if somebody comes on campus and demeans black kids, or if somebody comes on campus and demeans gay kids, or if somebody comes on campus and demeans Hispanic kids, or Muslims, or any protected victim, perceived victim group, the whole university immediately stands up and says, this is wrong, this is hate speech. You can come to the campus, and many times they won't even let them come to the campus, but if they've come to the campus and they've had an incident, sometimes it's off-campus incident. At UC San Diego, a few years ago, there was something called the Compton Cookout, and some frat boys off campus had a party with a ghetto theme, and it actually was the promoter of it was this strange disc jockey named Jigaboo Jones, of all things, and they were encouraged to come in ghetto garb, and so they were all dressed like African Americans, and it got back to the campus, and then somebody went on the radio station and made an anti-black remark. So the school, in responding to this, shut down the radio station, shut down the newspaper, punished the frat house for having the party, called the dean from Berkeley's law school down to do sensitivity training. They called in the NAACP. They had a day of silence and healing, an enormous output of moral outrage. Then they found a swastika on the campus a little while later. Not a peep. Not a peep. So that double standard also, and there's a double standard about who may say what on, because it's a long process. It's not as specific.
How would you evaluate President Obama's efforts for peace in his first term, and what role do you expect the Obama administration to play in the process over the next 4 years?
Well, I think there's an irony here. And the irony is that while there's no doubt been some significant clashes between, President Obama and Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu and other political issues between the two sides, it's almost like what I talked about, the best of times, the worst of times. It's exactly the same here. Certainly the political relationship has been one of the worst that it has been in a number of years. But on the other hand, and also Bibi didn't help matters by virtually endorsing Mitt Romney. But just because he knew him from Boston Consulting Company and elsewhere is not enough reason. But at the same time, it's also the best of relationships. It is the relationship that occurs first and foremost in the areas that matter most to Israel, since there isn't practicality. We're going to have an agreement with the Palestinians. But first of all, in the military relationship, in the intelligence relationship. In that relationship, we see extensive cooperation between Israel and the United States. We saw Operation Austere Challenger, where thousands of American troops came to Israel back in October. We saw Aegis-class destroyers off the coast of Israel. We saw X-band radar, 120 men stationed in the Negev in order to provide other 70 seconds of warning time if there were an Iranian strike. We saw cooperation in cyber warfare, in Olympic Games, in the attack of Stuxnets against the Iranian nuclear facilities. We've seen homeland security cooperation. We've seen terrorism cooperation, where Israel's created a virtual little village that American special forces have used, as even reported in the Israeli papers, to actually practice dealing with terrorism. Well, the politics has been, has been really terrible. On the other hand, what you might argue matters more for Israel is this military intelligence, cyber warfare, homeland security, medical, and nanotechnology, and all of that relationship that is absolutely booming between Israel and the United States. So that it really depends how you look at the relationship, but the reality is both are true. Final point, if you look at Chuck Hagel, who after all was not Israel's choice to be Secretary of Defense, although you could argue Secretary of Defense is often not the major decision-making here, what was interesting was what Chuck Hagel just said. I was in Nebraska recently, and of course they were very gung-ho about Chuck Hagel. But what was fascinating was that he just said yesterday that the window is rapidly closing for the Iranians for nuclear diplomacy. So here again is an irony that let's put it in a positive term, one of the least pro-Israel senators in the United States Senate is, in a sense, in order not just to get confirmation but to move on, to adopt basically the narrative and the position that certainly the pro-Israel community wants him to take, to close down that option, that if the Iranians continue to stall as they have been repeatedly stalling, not just according to Israel and the United States, But according to the international, IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Association, which is much more neutral, then we've actually seen something very important. So perhaps life works often in reverse, and maybe, just as with Hebrew, you shouldn't read it from left to right, but from right to left.
Given the demolition policy in the West Bank, and this is like over 12,000 demolition orders, and it's gone on regardless of administration, how does that fit in with the claims that Israel is trying to bring opportunity and trying to bring stability to the West Bank with all that's going on?
The concept is a bit, more complicated than what you're describing. The process by which Israel employs demolitions has to do with terrorist activity. And it has to do with the fact that when you identify what is considered to be, first of all, there are two issues. The acronym in Hebrew has to deal with the issue of illegal building, and the other one has to do with the fact that are those areas identified as they are, for example, in Rafah, for smuggling arms from Egypt into Gaza as far as arms. Now, the situation when it comes to the West Bank is somewhat different. The environment changed over the years until the fence was built as far as cracking down on terrorism. And so those are part of the rationale for doing so. Now, it's not a random act of just going in and demolishing homes because they want to. That's not the case. Any act of a demolition requires an agreement by a JAG officer and a judge that require what is going to happen, what is really in part of this process, and what is the goal of that. Now, there were demolishes when Israel was constructing the fence. There were issues that were obstructing the building of the fence, and it wasn't the fact that they went in and demolished the area because they were told. It was an issue. Those mostly had to do with agriculture, as far as olive groves, and as far as taking down those areas in order to build the fence. Those Palestinian families were compensated as well in order to make that fence happen, depending on where those areas were. So it has to be very clear about what we're talking about as far as active demolition. It only really the third criteria for demolition has been taken place by the IDF, and this is based on the judgments of the military court. Have to do with what happens when there is a scenario when the family is harboring terrorists, and there have been actions taken. Some of those actions have been also taken as far as homes, when you have families who've harbored terrorist activity, but those were really at the lowest part of the criteria as far as when you actually do this, because what Israel does mainly, it differentiates between who are even if there are family members who are not involved with groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas and whatnot. They don't blame the entire family because of one individual. But there have been extreme cases where, as a result of that, there were homes that were destroyed as far as issues as how illegal smuggling and harboring terrorists. That's where the demolitions come from, and that's where the policy comes from. But it's not a blanket. Nobody goes in to demolish any kind of homes without any kind of reason. The IDF would never allow it.
And there's one other point that's very important, which is it's tangential, but it's related to this. It is over exactly as Asaf was talking about the fence. It is that, very interestingly, Palestinians on the West Bank brought hundreds of cases, did not trust to do anything on the West Bank. They went to the Israeli Supreme Court, and on a number of occasions, the Israeli Supreme Court, even though technically West Bank Palestinians don't have legal standing, whereas they are not citizens, they are not green card holders, et cetera, like East Jerusalem Arabs are, nevertheless, the court on a number of occasions ruled in favor of the Palestinians, because the rule of law is very important. And when the Supreme Court ruled, and it's traditionally been kind of left of center, under Dorit Beinish absolutely until recently, those orders were followed by the Israel Defense Force.
Just the backdrop to this, of course, to some extent, is the Second Intifada, which the violence that broke out in late 2000 and killed eventually killed over 1,000 Israelis, was a traumatic experience for Israel. Talk to people whose kids, who had to put their kids on buses or hire cars, or worried every time a kid or a relative went from the house to school or went to visit somebody. Everybody knows, particularly in Jerusalem, everybody knows people who were affected by that intifada, and it's traumatic. And people, I take a group from Smith to Jerusalem on a program, and we have them meet Smith alums who happen to live in Israel, and that's all they talked about in the last 2 summers. And what the Israeli government did in order to stop the violence was to take very harsh measures. There's no question. The West Bank was, in some ways, reduced to the early 19th century with checkpoints, with disruption of trade, with all kinds of measures to make it very difficult to put together a suicide bombing operation. And they were entrepreneurial efforts. There were people who were hired to put together the bomb. There were people who were the transport executive experts. There were people who scouted out the areas. It was a business. Before before the Intifada erupted, Jenin, one of the towns in the West Bank, was the outlet capital of Israel, where on Saturday you couldn't even get near the town because people were going to get, discounted jeans and clothing. Afterwards, it became the suicide capital. And so the consequences were pretty harsh, and were very harsh, and there's still, it's going to take time to build up that trust again, to start on what I suggested were possibilities for improving life, some of which have started, but by no means have they, taken hold of general policy yet.
And it's important to mention that, exactly as you said, because of the Second Intifada, killing over 1,000 Israelis and thousands were injured and terrorized, people actually prayed when children were put on buses. That the flip side has now happened, therefore Israel took harsh measures, is that it has taken down over
Right.
90 of these obstacles and roadblocks on the West Bank as things have returned to a peaceful state under Salam Fayyad and Abu Mazen. So it really was a response both up and now down.
And from the numbers wise, another stat that's important, all the areas where the fence was there, the numbers were significantly decreased as far as active terrorism and smuggling.
By over
border.
90%.
Yeah, but there's another point to also make note of. Interestingly enough, a twisted irony, it is a Palestinian construction company who's building the fence. Members of Abbas's family, who also benefited from the environment itself. We have to also consider what, the economics are playing out here on both sides of the aisle. It's not, so these are, kind of the interesting aspects, they're also the same construction company that built the new neighborhood in Ramallah. But, this is all part of the construction itself and how that plays out in the politics and who gets these contracts by the PA and by Israel.
There's one last 20 seconds on this, which is that when they put the fence to block off part of the Palestinian population in Jerusalem, thousands of them have been buying apartments inside
yeah.
the Green Line in Israel, in places like French Hill,
Sure.
saying that they would prefer to live there than to live on the West
Right,
Bank.
yeah.
I was curious to know what you guys thought about outside influence being involved in peace negotiations like Oslo, as you guys have mentioned already. And if you think that's appropriate for outside influence to be involved in these talks when this is really going on over there, and they're the ones that have to deal with that, both on the Palestinian and Israeli side. And also keeping in mind 181, Resolution 181, and how that was, outside influence involved in the situation. And if you can, if it should be between these two groups, or if the outside influence should be there, and if not, if it should just be between the two groups, how to explain that to people in the global community that know that that's how, initially that's how we got to where we are.
the factors precipitating the final decision to engage in what became the Oslo peace process stemmed to a great extent from the fact that the PLO by 1992-93 had its back to the wall. In the 1980s, the Palestinian issue was virtually ignored because of the Iran-Iraq war. Then Arafat, and you saw some movement in 1988 by Arafat to 1987, the Intifada erupted. He seemed to be losing control of the West Bank. The Intifada was started, I know the people who planned the Intifada. When the Intifada started, it was nonviolent, relatively nonviolent, and very cautious, and the PLO was not in control of either tactics or strategy or diplomacy. It took them some time to gain control of the forces for the first Intifada. And Arafat's decision was, his position was also weakened by the first Gulf War, where he was perceived to have supported Saddam Hussein. The understanding I have is he started to form 4 or 5 groups. Each group of Palestinians had no idea of the other 4. There were separate groups that had some informal contacts with Israelis to see if something could go forward. The Oslo process took hold. I have one personal experience with that. The government department, we're just a college. We don't have graduate students. We're not a big deal place at Smith. But somehow somebody gave the government department, which has no money, some money to do a lecture series on places of trouble or something like that. So I got a call from the chair of the department who said, let's do something on, the Palestinian-Israeli issue. So I got Khalil Shikaki, whom I know, is a buddy of mine, and Moshe Maoz. Moshe Maoz was, I didn't know it until later, he was involved in some of the negotiations in Oslo. So this was going to be the academic year 1992-93. And we're trying to figure out with Moshe when he could come to Smith. And he said, oh yeah, I can come. Then he couldn't come. And he wanted to come through Oslo. And we said, coming from Israel to Northampton through Oslo? He wanted it because he needed the meetings. He ended up coming the day before the Jewish holiday of Passover. No one heard him. No one showed up to, but anyway, so we had our small role in helping the Oslo process. So, the Israelis and the Palestinians had to have the will and see some common ground. They couldn't do it all by themselves, so they sought American intervention and American help. You could say that something similar happened with Sadat and Begin. They sort of negotiated via Barbara Walters and Walter Cronkite on TV, and they started together, but they needed help after they expressed that desire. So you've got to have the will to go the distance, and then you can call for outside help to get you through the tough parts. But it's got to come initially from the parties themselves.
I guess what I'm...
Because the UN is justifiably perceived as being notoriously anti-Israel, and that it's stacked so against Israel and Israel's interests that it could never be an honest broker. I think you do need outsiders. I think you need outsiders because outsiders are subsidizing the Palestinian Authority with hundreds of millions of dollars, and America is subsidizing Israel to some extent by the $3 billion a year that we give them in military hardware and so forth and other support. And we can leverage with soft diplomacy. And I think the two parties probably don't trust each other enough that they want other adults sitting at the table who can be honest brokers and help them hammer out a deal. Because those other brokers have their own interests in making a deal happen. So we had Annapolis, we've had this, the roadmap, the Saudi plan. People have proposed plans, but it usually has come from the outside, and for different reasons. But I think you're going to have other people sitting at the table. And they're outsiders, but they can make the deal happen, because they're, in some ways, they're the bankers, they're the ones that can ensure that a peace will last, and they're going to make rules that everybody has to play by. The Israelis are dubious about the Palestinians, I'm sure.
The fact that they host individuals like Ahmadinejad, you can make all these comments on American soil. There's a whole other story about the United Nations and its functionality at large. That being said, if you look at a peace process and states, it does require beyond the need of the two parties, it also requires some kind of guarantees to make this happen. And that's where our investment and taxpayer dollars get involved. You have to have somebody to back up all this stuff. Who was backing, the reason, we have vested interest in both parties succeeding, peace in the Middle East, and we agreed, but we were also asked to be part of this. It's a push and pull environment, but it requires outside brokerage to put up that, a more or less of a neutral environment, and also to guarantee some kind of financial support to ensure its success. There's a lot of money that was poured into this in the 80s and in the 90s. We gave Yasser Arafat millions of dollars that never reached the Palestinian street. The Palestinians, the reason they were all hovering over Yasser Arafat when he was on his deathbed, not because they loved Yasser Arafat, they wanted to know where the money was. Till this day, the PA still pays Sue Arafat approximately $100,000 a month for a Champagne and Coco Chanel Paris. It's a very interesting, there's a lot of corruption involved in all this. One of the more common illustrations was probably, when Sua she was not in Gaza for a very long time. One of the more common pictures you would see is that she had a jarring BMW Beamer. And every time she would ride in the streets of Gaza, you would see Palestinians spitting where that car drove. A very telling illustration how they felt about Sue Arafat and Yasser Arafat, and the disconnect between the level of poverty among the Palestinian proletariat, more or less, and amongst the elite, and where the money was going while he was raising millions of dollars. So that is also a question about the functionality of what would lead to a potential state, but also where the money is going and how it's going to reach people, which is where our friend Salam Fayyad is doing pretty good work. Is the money has, we can trace the money, we know where it's going, it's actually doing some kind of state building and institutional buildings in order to create a positive state. That did not happen under Yasser Arafat. Fayyad was the same individual who told Arafat, you can't go around and pick up trucks every 2 weeks and give out dollars to all your people. And Arafat looked at him puzzled and said, why? Everybody else in the Arab world does it. And he said, that's exactly why. We got to create direct banking. We got to create a state. And Arafat could not grasp that concept. So that has to be also a movement helping, building an infrastructure will lead to something better than where we are now. But that also requires outside powers that'll make this happen.
I was wondering if each of you would, share your vision or your imagined response of the community here to promote peace abroad. Would you say by combating negative campaigns here or through educating the public? I would like to hear each of your respective opinions.
Well, I'm a believer, for obvious reasons, in education. I've noticed, I was thinking when Richard was speaking, one of the things that I've noticed at Smith is how reluctant some of the activists who are, for the justice for Palestine, they never come to lectures or enroll in courses to learn about the Middle East, which I find very puzzling. I think if the more people really engage with the kind of historical background necessary to see what Zionism really is all about and was all about, what the Palestinian movement has been about. I think the more people who do that, the more they'll understand what's going on, and the more they'll be realistic about what can be done.
I agree with Donna. I mean, I think that, we're all academics, we all believe in education, but I think that, part of the biggest problems that exist within Palestinian society is, the incitement in mosques and schools and what's happening. I mean, that has to happen at this level. I mean, on a positive side, one of the largest recipients of Fulbright scholars are Palestinians. I mean, if you look at the numbers and where they're getting, they're coming for an education in the States. And so the question is to take that education, embrace it, and try to, apply it within, their own respective societies. And that's not always happening. And so we have to, educating to peace, which has been the phrase for a very long time. It also has to have a more, it has to have some traction in order to make it happen. Otherwise, all this, what's happening as far as rejectionism and violence is going to continue.
We spoke at a high school this morning, and one of the high school students, I think it was a sophomore, asked me the same general question. What can we do? What would you like to see happen on campuses? And I said, I hope I didn't say this today, I'm getting senile, and also I'm speaking for 4 days now. I said, if, I think I told you this, if the Ku Klux Klan came to a campus and were burning a cross and making derogatory comments about African Americans and Jews and Catholics and were spewing their hatred, most college students at this point in time would walk by them, either would think they was silly or walk by or chastise them for being such racist and so ignorant. And it would be nice in the future if people came to a mock apartheid wall on a campus or a mock checkpoint or the Star of David dripping in blood and all of these other themes and motifs that we see at anti-Israel events all over the country all through the year, and say, what are you talking about? Israel's an apartheid state. It's not. But that's going to take educating people about the truth so that we turn the world right side up. So that, and a lot of what we at Scholars for Peace in the Middle East do, and people like Alan Dershowitz and Asaf and I do relentlessly, is when something happens on a campus and somebody says something outrageous or is promoting a course or an event that is wrong and libelous and slanderous to Israel or just hateful, we answer back. We make them defend themselves. We shame them. We call attention to the idiocy of what they're doing and the immorality of what they're doing. And the fact that it's, lies and distortions of fact and ahistorical. And it's such a tsunami of hatred and anti-Semitism that it's an enormous problem that is very challenging. Even if all of us in this room and all of us all over the world were fighting it, it's still going to be a huge problem. But it is a way of shifting it, because you have to make the people that are spewing the lies stop doing it, because they're pointed out as being wrong, and you shame them or expose them, or you have to educate people from a young age what the true story of Israel is, so that there isn't that hatred. You have to start somewhere, and universities are important. Why? Because kids go through them. Kids come into colleges with relatively open minds. They haven't made up their minds about life and about history and about their beliefs. So if the colleges are free of this stagnation and this stench of scholastic ineptitude and lies and contortions, and kids come out of college without these poisonous attitudes, they'll become better parents. They'll become better diplomats. They'll become better officials. And they'll become better members of the media. And so that will gradually change. The universities are a valuable target for us because an important process in a person's intellectual life when they're learning and developing this political correctness. Now, the problem is that do you know that in society, in American society, it's almost a 50-50 split, what liberal to conservative or Democrat to Republican. Pretty much, not exactly, but you can see from the recent elections, it's fairly close. They've done surveys of faculty who self-describe themselves as either liberal or conservative, which is in medical schools and the professional schools, it might be 8-to-1 liberal to conservative. But in the social sciences, departments and the humanities, sociology, anthropology, 35-to-1 liberal to conservative. What does that mean? Generally speaking, liberals identify with victim groups, and they're the ones that are promoting this political correctness. They're the ones that feel bad for the Palestinians, want social justice for the Palestinians, and very often influence their students to take that line of thinking. That's why the universities are an important place for us to try to affect change. Yes, it's a multi-headed dragon. It has 1,000 heads. That's the problem. And we have a toothpick, not a sword. But you have to start somewhere, and we have to start cutting the heads off.
What we should remember one thing, so let me end this discussion of on our part, this gang of four, with just one positive fact. And that is, if you look at the polling data, if you look at all Americans, it's 50-10 in favor of Israel. That is very powerful, that the other side is at 10%. If you look at a recent poll of people who are under 30 in America, it's really 18 to 30, it's 38 to 15. That means the other side has moved all the way from 10 to 15%. I think we need to keep in mind that fortunately the good sense of most Americans makes them not respond to what they're hearing on campus. I think what we need to do, in addition to everything that Richard and others have talked about, is also to expose that vast middle ground, which is, I think, in a sense, the greatest problem, because the chattering class on the other side is actually a very small, if well-financed and well-organized element. As the polling data suggest, however, for example, even among Americans of all ages, 40% have no views on this conflict. And then among younger people, if it's 38 to 15, that means 47% have no views. I think what's important is they need to be exposed. I think Birthright does a good job of that, Stand With Us, APEC and other organizations, but there's room to do a lot more and to connect people with the Israel experience.